Today in our study of Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America, their history, and keep in mind they used to be called the Reformed Presbyterian Church in the United States. That name has been co-opted by a small split off the PCA, started by Joe Morecraft and others many years ago. And that group, they're not Covenanters at all, so they really shouldn't have adopted that name. But Reformed Presbyterian Church in the United States, which are now called the Reformed Presbyterian Church of North America. Not in North America, it should say in, but they have of, which is kind of bizarre. But we're looking at the Covenant of 1871. I did make a mistake 2 weeks ago. Last week I had to do a baptism someplace. But 2 weeks ago I mentioned a covenant of 1854. I meant to say the covenant of 1954. There was a covenant made in 1954 which is really very poor, and perhaps we'll look at that sometime, but they, you could tell they kind of didn't know what they were doing. The Covenant of 1871 is much better, and we'll look at that, and we'll look at the critiques of it by the Steelites and others. Now, we started on this a little bit, just a teeny bit last time, and the big critics of this covenant of 1871 were the Steelites. The Steelite critics point out that if there are aspects of the old covenants particular to the British Isles, which the RPCNA believed were not applicable to the American situation, they could have deliberated and studied the old covenants and stated what changes needed to be made. And no such study was conducted. Now, keep in mind, as we look at this, there are two forms of view. One is that, look, we need an American covenant. Let's just have an American covenant. And something particular to America. And then the other view is that, yeah, we should have an American covenant, but we still should explicitly acknowledge the previous covenants and make this a covenant renovation. That's the big debate we're having here with the Steelites. If there's ambiguity as to whether the old covenants in Scotland and the Psalm League Covenant apply to America, if there's ambiguity, we definitely need an American covenant. I personally believe that they are applicable in the sense that we were a colony of Great Britain when the covenant was made, the covenants were made, and but even if you don't agree with that, we still need a covenant. The Steelite critics point out, and this is from the Reformed Presbytery, this is their magazine, here's what they say, and there's no author to this, this is from the Reward Advocate Review of the New Covenant. Quote, "It is true that in the preamble to the report of the Special Committee on Covenanting, to which were referred memorials on covenanting at Norwood in 1868, covenant renovation is once named. But it is evident that the Special Committee did not desire a renovation of the covenants after all, for if they had, this desire would have made its appearance in the resolution accompanying the report, as well as in the preamble. The preamble was not submitted for the adoption of synod, but only the resolution. It is as follows, quote, "Therefore resolved that synod appoint a special committee to prepare the draft of a covenant, not a draft renewing the covenants, and make all necessary arrangements for entering upon the work of covenanting, not upon the work of covenant renovation, without unnecessary delay." End of quote. The Steelite author of the Review of the New Covenant, who is not named, says that he attended the synod that approved the covenant of 1871. The author gives some quotes from memory where members of the synod indicated, quote, this is from the same article, their desire to get away from the obligation of the British covenants. One member says, quote, "We have nothing to do with these covenants any more than we have with the covenants of Germany. There is much lumber in these covenants, and the shortest way to get rid of the lumber is to get rid of the covenants." End of quote. Well, the problem with that, of course, is that if there's anything in the covenants that's biblical, you can't get away from the covenants. If there's stuff that applies only to Great Britain, or let's say it says you have to pray for the Queen of Bohemia or something, and there is no Queen of Bohemia anymore, then that obviously doesn't apply. But anything that's moral in content would apply. The Reverend S.O. Wiley, speaking at synod, summed up the attitude of those who held to a different view of the old Scottish or British covenants. After Wiley took offense that his view was interpreted to mean that he was not, quote, "as much attached to the covenants as our ancestors as they," quote, he went on to say, quote, "The aim of our bond, the design of the drafting committee, was Americanize the covenants, to have an American covenant, not a British, for the American church, so that we can say to applicants for membership, here is our covenant. We term it the bond, the covenant of the Reformed Presbyterian Church of the United States. If we adopt, we say to the people, this is our covenant. This is our national covenant. The covenants are not the link uniting us with the Church of the Reformation. That link is the Confession of Faith and other Westminster documents. The point of contact lies in these. End of quote. The Seceders also interpreted the 1871 covenant as a wholly new covenant, not a covenant renovation. Quote, it is gratifying to us that the Synod entered upon such a course has framed a new covenant, adapted to its position and circumstances. We cannot well understand, we never could, how a church in the United States has any right to bind its members to a federal deed belonging to another nation. The step now taken by the American Synod lifts them out of the rut of an equivocal and ambiguous position. End of quote. Now, what made the document, the Covenant of 1871, a defective document for the Steelites, made this new bond deserving of praise for the Seceders? If the 1871 covenant was a totally new covenant and not a renovation, then the Seceders had every reason to praise the covenant, for it moved the RPCNA closer to the Seceder position and further away from the Steelites. So they thought it was good. Now, an important question for the purpose of this study was whether or not the RPCNA considered the covenant of 1871 to be a totally new covenant or a covenant renovation. The Confession of Sin in the 1871 covenant says, quote, we in obedience to the command of God, conformably to the practice of the godly in former times, and recognizing all that is moral in the covenants of our worthy religious progenitors of the Second Reformation, do hereby give ourselves in covenant to God, to his church, and to one another. And that's a quote from the Synod of the RPCNA, 1872. This statement, which was not in the original Confession of Sin, adopted at New York in 1870, was added in Pittsburgh in 1871 to obviate the objections of some of the Covenanter ministers. Okay, so it's clear that you did have people who said, look, the Psalm League and Covenant and the Covenant of 1581 and 1638, they're Scottish covenants. They really don't apply to the United States. We need a wholly new covenant. There were people who thought that way, but there were a lot of people who didn't think that way, so they had to have a document that satisfied both parties, in essence. The statement does recognize the covenants, plural. The committee whose task it was to deal with objections to the covenant went so far in trying to satisfy objections that they passed a resolution saying, quote, that in order to satisfy the scruples of some members of Synod, we understand that the expression covenants of the Second Reformation includes the National Covenant of Scotland and the Solemn League and Covenant of the Three Kingdoms. End of quote. All the men who were not satisfied with the new bond were swung over by the above resolution, except 2 ministers and 1 ruling elder. And that's a good resolution. You know, if you're going to have a new covenant, at least acknowledge the former ones as good and lawful, etc. The Steelite version of events is slightly different. The Steelites say that all 3 objections were by teaching elders. The Reverend William Milroy, Northwest Ohio, the Reverend Dr. A. Stevenson, New York, and the Reverend J.W. Shaw, Coldenham, New York. Out of these 3, 2 would eventually be won over, Milroy and Stevenson. Reverend Milroy even preached a positive sermon about the covenant at Synod. Reverend Stevenson contributed a chapter to the memorial volume on the benefits of covenanting. Reverend J.W. Shaw refused to swear the bond and left the RPCNA sometime after 1876, yet before 1878. After Shaw left the RPCNA, the denomination made the 1971 covenant a necessary part of their ordination vows. This was approved by Synod in 1878. For 7 years, one could be a covenanter minister while rejecting the 1871 bond, or at least not accepting it. Doesn't necessarily mean you emphatically reject it. This fact indicates that the RPCNA probably did not want to lose the Reverend J.W. Shaw over this issue. Once he left, it became obligatory. Okay, so in the 1870s, the Covenanters in America still believed in covenanting and still required covenanting for ordination. So they were better in the 1870s than they are today, where covenanting is not even discussed. It's not an issue. After Milroy and Stevenson were won over and the bond was sworn by Synod, a pastoral letter was prepared at the direction of Synod to be sent around to all the churches in order to instruct and convince all the office bearers and church members to swear the bond. This pastoral letter quite explicitly says that the RPCNA church members are under obligation to the National Covenant of Scotland and the Psalm League and Covenant. And let me just remark here. Even if you say, well, look, those were Scottish covenants in the Psalm League and Covenant were for the three kingdoms, and it really doesn't apply to America, even if you don't accept the argument that we were a part, or they had a footing in America with the colonies, it still applies to the church because it was sworn by the Presbyterian Church. So as a church, it applies to the church, whether you believe it applies to the nation or not. Anyway, here's a quote. Quote, compare the covenant, 1871, with the covenants, under the obligation of which the church acknowledges herself to be already placed, and endeavor intelligently to understand how, in terms of this bond, we are adapting to our circumstances, renewing and practically applying all that the church in this land recognizes as of descending obligation upon us in the National Covenant of Scotland and the Psalm League and Covenant of England, Scotland, and Ireland. That's part of the pastoral letter. The pastoral letter must have been quite successful in convincing the various RPCNA congregations and sessions to swear the bond when one considers that this new covenant was rejected by 11 sessions when first distributed. So where they itched, that was taken care of. They were satisfied, and everybody swore the covenant. The Reverend William Milroy preached a sermon on covenant keeping called Fidelity to Vows after the bond was sworn in Pittsburgh in 1871. The fact that Milroy, who strictly adhered to the sending obligation of the covenants, and who would not swear the bond until convinced that it was faithful to the past covenants, was chosen to preach is significant. Synods are not known for letting ministers with whom they strongly disagree preach at such an important event. By the way, Alexander Henderson preached after the Psalm League and Covenant was sworn. Milroy says in his sermon, quote, we hold ourselves still bound by the covenants of our fathers, familiarly known by the designation National and Solemn League. Indeed, if the principle to which we have given renewed expression in this our covenant be just and true, viz., that the obligation of moral covenants which contemplate posterity descends upon those represented in the taking of them till their end is accomplished, then it follows as a necessary consequence that we could rid ourselves of the obligations of the covenants of our fathers if we would. And I hope it is equally true, we would not if we could. End of quote. So, in my view, although there may be some within the RPCNA who don't hold to covenanting as they ought, they all swore to it, they all agreed to it, and they all agreed to the sending obligations of the covenants in their moral aspects. Milroy, speaking for the whole synod in a sermon, goes on to say, quote, we stand then this day before the churches in the world in the solemn attitude of covenanters, avowing our belief in and cordial reception of the principles embodied in this our bond, proclaiming at the same time one undiminished attachment and continued adherence to the covenants of our fathers, and convinced of their moral and spiritual character, deliberately expressing under the solemnity of an oath our settled determination with the help of God, unfalteringly to vindicate and maintain both the one and the other. End of quote. So nothing could be more explicit than these statements by Milroy to Synod, that the RPCNA was not forsaking the past covenants. They indeed adhered to them, explicitly. Milroy even goes on to say in his sermon that the reason Scotland had been corrupted by high church Episcopalianism is because it forsook the Solemn League and Covenant. He says that the doctrine of the descending obligation of the covenants, quote, which we so recognize, unquote, is necessary for the unity of the church. Now, the declension of Presbyterianism in the 20th century has rejected covenanting because it's rejected confessionalism for loose subscriptionism, When you have loose subscriptionism and everybody can do what is right in his own mind within, there's certain things that they can't deny, like justification by faith. Oh, but the OPC and PCA have people that deny that too. But they're not. But when you have loose subscriptionism, you can't have covenanting because you can't have any kind of uniformity. It's called ecclesiastical chaos. And you have to understand that it's connected to prelacy and Romanism because instead of adhering and swearing to a document that is biblical, it's whatever the presbytery happens to believe at that moment in time that becomes the standard. And then you have, like, I know of a man who was denied licensure in the PCA because he was a strict Sabbatarian. And then allegedly, recently in the RPCNA, a man was denied licensure, eligibility to receive a call because he didn't believe in Christmas. And they were afraid that would be offensive to people that he didn't believe in Christmas, which is purely Romanistic. That was the Great Lakes Gulf Presbytery, by the way. While there is clear enough evidence to proclaim the covenants of 1871 innocent of forsaking the past covenants, the covenant of 1871 is not as clear as it should have been. If the new covenant had been as explicit and unequivocal as the Arkansas Renovation, there would have been no need for all the maneuvering to convince ministers and ruling elders that the covenant was not deficient in such critical matters. At the covenant renovation of 1638, the whole covenant of 1581 was attached to the new national covenant. Both were publicly read before being sworn. At the Arkansas Renovation in 1712, the Solemn League and Covenant was publicly read twice before being renewed. In the Arkansas Renovation, the concluding sentence of the acknowledgement of sin says in explicit and unambiguous terms, quote, "We do again renew our Solemn League and Covenant," end quote. Rather than argue and have to convince the unsatisfied ministers, why not just say, "We do again renew the covenants of 1581 and 1638, the Solemn League and Covenant, and the Arkansas Renovation"? If there are aspects of any of these covenants that apply only to the British Isles or only to Scotland, then explain what does not apply to the covenanters in America. The covenant of 1871 is well-crafted, in spite of having said this, it is a well-crafted document. Yet covenants are so important for the church and so infrequently engaged in it would have been wise to rewrite parts of the new covenant rather than make statements not in the covenant to satisfy the disgruntled. All I'm saying is here, you got to make the covenant clear enough to where you don't have to have all these committees and try to get people who are not happy to be satisfied. A third possibility is that a group of ministers consciously or unconsciously conspired to shift the 1871 covenant away from old covenants as much as possible. There is the possibility that these men were willing to maneuver and compromise because of opposition to their plan for a wholly new covenant. The vagueness and equivocal nature of the new covenant was so that the conservative ministers would vote for it at synod. Okay, that's a theory. And I think the Steelites adhere to that theory. This theory would explain why the synodical committee that was appointed to deal with the objections of the 1871 covenant was totally opposed to making changes in the covenant text itself, yet would go to great lengths to make statements and resolutions to get those opposed to the new covenant to change their minds. Some very prominent RPCNA ministers, for example, Reverend Dr. Sloan, Reverend A.M. Milligan, Reverend S. Carlisle, and the Reverend Dr. Sproul, did make statements at Synod indicating their desire to put the old covenants to rest. The Reverend Milligan even went so far as to say he would like to see the Scottish covenants laid to rest, quote, like the body of Moses in the land of Moab, end of quote. Both Sloan and Sproul opposed making any changes in the text of the covenant itself. Now, I do not have access to enough documents to definitively make a judgment with regard to whether this theory is true or not. Perhaps if I was in Pittsburgh, I could get the documents. But this theory does explain why such an important document was vague in certain areas. In other words, they had people who wanted to dispose of the Scottish covenants altogether, but they had a lot of people that were in favor of covenant renewal of all the old covenants, and so they tried to satisfy both parties. That's a distinct possibility. This theory also explains why those who wanted a totally new covenant were so willing to make statements and resolutions in favor of the old covenants, yet were so unwilling to alter the text of the new covenant. Some resolutions were made to win over the conservative ministers, and Reverend Milroy was even allowed to preach after the bond was sworn. But the text of the covenant was not changed except for the addition of, quote, recognizing all that is moral in the covenants of our worthy religious progenitors of the Second Reformation, which is in the Confession of Sin. And I think that's pretty good. I'd be very happy if we could get, if the RPCNA would do that today. I'd be very happy. The fact that the Reverend Milway preached and that certain resolutions were made would be long forgotten, while the covenant itself would not be forgotten. Well, although it has been forgotten today, obviously. Unfortunately, though, the covenant of 1871 has already been forgotten in the RPCNA, and it is not required anymore at all. The problem with this theory is that it paints some of the covenant administrators as deceitful and dishonest. While I raise the possibility that this could be true, I personally would like to give my brothers in the Lord the benefit of the doubt. The second major criticism of the covenant of 1871 is that it does not teach our nation is obligated to defend the true religion and oppose every false religion. Quote, "The new covenant gives this grand principle because it does not teach the nation that it is its duty to establish by law the true Reformed religion, and to judicially declare that no false religion or one opposed to God's covenant religion is established by law has any civil rights or immunities, because false religion is hostile to and destructive of all true government, both human and divine, civil and ecclesiastical." And let me see who that is. I hate this. I have endnotes instead of footnotes. That was probably the Steelite magazine. Well, I'll look it up later. The author, Defects of the New Covenant, believed that, quote, "a mere ecclesiastical covenant and religious is radically defective." Of course, what more could they do? The United States was radically unbiblical and pluralistic in nature. Really, all they could do is have an ecclesiastical statement with a desire, a prayer for reformation in the state. The state as well as the church must promote and defend true Christianity, obviously. The fact that America is not a Christian country, the fact that the Constitution is anti-Christian, the fact that by far most Americans are opposed to the covenant and Reformation is no reason, they would say, not to include the state in the covenant. Quote, "The fact that we live in a nation that is opposed to believing, receiving, and establishing the true religion is no reason why we should cast this great biblical principle into the background. But on the contrary, it is a reason why we should be more zealous in promoting and maintaining it." The author argues that we must include the civil government in our covenants because in Scotland the state adopted the covenants, that is, except the Alcantara Renovation. He also says that not just church members, but citizens swear the covenants. Well, all you can really do in a church covenant is say that it is our goal, it is our desire, it is our prayer that the state do A, B, C, and D. That's all you can do, because the state is going to ignore what you say. And if you say, well, you can say our government is obligated to submit to Jesus Christ as Lord, that's absolutely true. You can say stuff like that, but that doesn't mean that they're going to do it. The basis for the argument against the 1871 covenant, including the civil obligation, is that Scripture clearly teaches that nations must acknowledge the covenant with Jesus Christ. The author recognizes that, quote, "the church cannot unite with the state without its consent. But the church has a responsibility of showing the state its duties toward Christ. The covenant of 1871, according to this author, fails to point out the state's sins and duties." Does the covenant of 1871 fail in its responsibility to press the claims and dominion of Jesus Christ toward the state? In this instance, I believe the Steelite critic has clearly overstated the case regarding the new covenant and the state. Yeah, I was quoting from a Steelite magazine, an article in a Steelite magazine. The nation, quote, "the nation refuses to own its responsibility to God and to the mediator, to recognize the supremacy of the Bible in national affairs, and to countenance and encourage the true religion. The confession of sin contains an element considered essential by the Steelite critic, a clear recognition that the state must encourage the true religion. Under point number 3, the text of the New Covenant clearly teaches that the nations must bow the knee to Christ and submit to his authority. Quote, "persuaded that God is the source of all legitimate power, and that he has instituted civil government for his own glory and the good of men, that he has appointed his son, the mediator, to headship over the nations, and that the Bible is the supreme law and rule and national as all other things, we will maintain the responsibility of nations to God, the rightful dominion of Jesus Christ over the commonwealth, and the obligation of nations to legislate in conformity with the written word," end of quote. Now that sounds pretty good to me. I'd be very happy if we could get anyone to swear to that today, including the RPCNA. The covenant goes on to say that not only do we pray and labor for our country to constitutionally recognize, quote, God as the source of all power, of Jesus Christ as the ruler of the nations, of the Holy Scriptures as the supreme rule, end of quote, but also, quote, the true Christian religion, end of quote. Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Sounds pretty darn good. I like it. The Covenant of 1871 does neglect to explicitly say that the state is obligated to oppose every false religion, but it is clearly implied in the covenant and in the Confession of Sin. The Confession of Sin rebukes our nation for allowing, quote, atheists, infidels, and all classes of vile men, end of quote, to serve in government. The covenant says that, quote, the nation must legislate according to God's written word, end of quote. This would certainly include the first table of the law and the suppression of wicked heresy. So the RPCNA in 1871 was still pretty darn good. Now, they had some legalistic stuff on alcohol that we've discussed in past lectures that was bad. I could live without beer. You know, I wouldn't want to, but I could live without it for the sake of peace. But the problem is do they have the right to impose that on others? They don't. There's also external evidence that the Reformed Presbyterian Church in North America held views virtually identical to the Steelite critic from a paper delivered by A.M. Moore at the First International Conference of Reformed Presbyterian Churches. Moore, in 1896, says this, quote, has a corporate body or a nation the right to frame a covenant or make vows to serve the Lord? Our answer to such a question must be that it is not only permissible, but desirable. Yes, obligatory, end of quote. Moore teaches that both church and state are obligated to make covenant unto the Lord. The state is obligated because Jehovah is the lawgiver. Jesus Christ created the world, and Jesus Christ is the governor of all nations. At the same conference, the Reformed Presbyterian minister from Philadelphia, the Reverend T.P. Stevenson, made a statement identical to the Steelite position. Quote, but they, that is covenanters, saw clearly and steadfastly maintain that the state should help the church by the moral influence of his high example in acknowledging Christ as king and accepting his law. The state can powerfully assist the church by discharging the whole duty of the state in its own sphere according to the law of Christ, by repressing wickedness, by promoting good morals, by educating all the children of the Commonwealth in the common unsectarian principles of our holy religion. Now, I'd question where it's the state's responsibility to do that. It's not, but it's a fairly good statement. The second major criticism of the Covenant of 1871 by the Steelites is clearly overstated. The authors of the 1871 Covenant could have been more careful in framing the state's obligation. But there can be no doubt that the RPCNA, at least as late as 1896, still held to a position virtually identical with the Steelites. The Steelite critics should have been more charitable in this particular area and given the authors of the 1871 Covenant the benefit of the doubt. But sometimes our strongest critics are our closest relatives. Conclusion. There are a number of important factors that can be culled from this brief study of the Steelite criticisms of the 1871 Covenant. First, we learned something about the Steelite critics themselves. There is no doubt that the Steelite critics were onto something in their critique of the New Covenant. But the Steelites were so opposed to the RPCNA and their presuppositions, they, in my opinion, overstated the case. They weren't charitable. The Steelites believed that the RPCNA was totally abandoning the covenants of their forefathers. This study of the 1871 Covenant, some of the events surrounding its adoption, showed that the situation in the RPCNA was actually much more complicated. The RPCNA of 1871 shows us that there were many ministers opposed to the old way of thinking regarding the Scottish covenants. And there were many ministers who still held to the old ways. When two groups of elders and ministers who held opposing viewpoints on a point of view of doctrine get together, the result is either a church split, a decision to ignore the issues, that's what most denominations do today, they have loose subscriptionism, do whatever you want, or there's a compromise. The Covenant of 1871 is, in my opinion, a compromise document. By this, I do not mean that it was a self-conscious compromise. I do not believe that both sides of the issue sat down and said, let's comprise a document and make a compromise. I believe that through debate, disagreement, political maneuvering, and so on, a document was formed that satisfied both sides. And there is even the possibility that both sides believe they achieved their own particular goals. In any case, the confession of sin makes it clear they acknowledge past covenants. So it's not a bad document. It's acceptable. It's not a bad document. The events surrounding the covenant of 1871 show us that among a group of ministers, some of which were very prominent, for example, Sproul and Sloane, there was a paradigm shift in the way the Scottish covenants were viewed sometime after the mid-19th century. If the Covenanters had covenanted in 1805 or even in 1845, there probably would have been no disagreement over the binding nature of the Scottish covenants. Those who disagreed in the past would have left and joined the Seceders or other Presbyterian bodies. One of the lessons of the study of the 1871 covenant that is important for today is that the long doctrinally detailed covenants of our forefathers presuppose the need for theologically literate, historically literate church members. Okay, when we talk about covenanting and we talk about the history of the RPCNA, most ministers are not literate, most elders are not literate, either theologically or historically. If we are going to hold the binding nature of the National Scottish Covenants and the Psalm League Covenant, which at least mentally apply to us ecclesiastically, then we should work hard to ensure that the RPCNA church members are aware of the rich and blessed heritage, their rich and blessed heritage, and their biblical duty to corporately covenant unto the Lord. Now, this is 1871. The RPCNA today, I know I was in the RPCNA for almost 20 years. And most ministers that I know don't have a clue what covenanting even is, and most don't believe in it. They don't believe in it at all. Now, I think if they studied it, I think if they learned about it theologically, they would believe in it. Many would. But the RPCNA has to get back to its roots, not because we believe in tradition, not because we believe that tradition has any merit or anything like that, but because they were biblical. Covenanting, and you notice the RPCNA had a very good view of God's law. Covenanting, a biblical view of the law of God over the nations, because that's the only way to restrain the state. Covenanting, a biblical view of the nations, and an optimistic eschatology, and a view of a state that recognizes Jesus Christ as Lord. These things are all necessary for theonomy to be successful, in the good sense of the term theonomy. These things are all necessary if America is to be rescued from its march to the abyss. So we have to recognize that the U.S. Constitution is anti-Christian. For all, and it's, as constitutions go, it's one of the better constitutions out there. But when you don't recognize Christ and you don't require men who serve in the civil government, who serve as judges, who serve on juries, to swear to the Trinity and Jesus Christ as God and the true Christian religion, which is Calvinistic and so forth, if you don't require that, you've basically chosen a future of judgment and calamity. No matter how good our economy is at present, things are going to collapse. And look at the debt. Look at the national debt, how it's growing. Republicans aren't going to control it. The Republicans didn't get rid of Obamacare. They just have switched it to Obamacare Light. That's all they want to do, because they're implicit statists as well. The only way to stop statism is a recognition of Jesus Christ as Lord. If you don't recognize him as Lord, the state wants to be Lord, whether you're Republican or Democrat. So we would hope that our RPCNA brothers would go back to covenanting and go back to strict conscriptionism and get rid of the sloppy evangelicalism and pragmatism in their midst, and they'd be a lot better off. Let us pray. Father, we give you thanks, Lord, for this covenant of 1871. We pray that it would, the RPCNA would recognize it as they're obligated to do morally because they swore it, and that they would require it of their ministers and elders and church members. They'd be far better off if they did. We pray for reformation in the RPCNA, and we pray that there would be those who are really not in favor of biblical worship and covenanting, that they could go join the PCA or OPC and take their corruption out of the RPCNA. We pray for that in Jesus' name. Amen.